Hi folks, now we're on to the next of the cardiovascular topics. This is the structure and function of the heart. Now you may notice that the board is quite busy with this one. Now I'd imagine with this video you'll be wanting to pause and rewind and watch parts of it again. I'll try and do the whole thing as one video so that it's the whole topic, but I think all things considered it will be better for you to be thinking more about it as being parts of small sections of a large topic. We're going to start off by revising what we know about the heart already. I would hope that you would look at that diagram and more or less recognise a heart. You should have a working knowledge of the chambers of the heart, the direction the blood moves in the heart, and yeah, as a basic. So we have two veins. One on the left side of the heart, one on the right side of the heart. This is what we call the left side of the heart. It's the right side of the diagram, but the left side of the heart. That's the left atrium and left ventricle. That's the right atrium and right ventricle. As I said, these are two veins. This one is bringing blood back from the lungs, so that one's the pulmonary vein. Oxygenated blood then enters the left atrium, then into the left ventricle, and then out through the aorta, where it's delivered to sites all around the body, because the left side deals with oxygenated blood. You'll also note that the left side is slightly thicker because it's more muscular, it has to send the blood further. So this is where you get really high pressure blood that's just been pumped out of the heart. The right side of the heart deals with deoxygenated blood. So this is bringing blood back from the body. This vein here is called the vena cava. Deoxygenated blood then enters the right atrium, then into the right ventricle, and then it leaves the heart through what's called the pulmonary artery, and the pulmonary artery carries deoxygenated blood back to the lungs, where eventually through the process of exchange through capillaries, which we talked about in the last video, the blood then becomes oxygenated and eventually returns to the heart via the pulmonary vein. Right, so that's your kind of standard things that you should have known already. I've also labelled on here the semilunar valves, which is a valve, two valves called semilunar valves, one of which is found in each of the two arteries, just on the exit to the rest of the body from the heart. So these are not actually found in the arteries. No, we learn that veins contain valves, arteries don't contain valves, but you do have little valves just on the way out the blood, the heart. We also have atrioventricular valves, which are so named because they're between the atrium and the ventricle. Remember what valves do, they prevent the backflow of blood, so we're going to talk about them in a wee bit of detail. We also will end up talking about the brain's control of the heart. We'll also talk about ways to measure heart activity, and here this is a very brief diagram of something called an electrocardiogram, and we'll talk about that, where that's a measure of the electricity that's travelling across the heart. So without any further ado then, we've talked about the function of the heart. If you're still not quite sure what exactly the function of the heart is, and the exchange of blood between the left and right side, and the oxygenated, deoxygenated and everything else, go and listen to the first couple of minutes again. So we're kind of three and a half minutes in. So those first 3.5 minutes, watch them until you're happy that you understand what the heart's actual function is. We're going to move on now to talk about this idea here, cardiac output, as a measure of heart activity. Okay, so what you can hopefully see, I realise from the screen it's maybe not all that clear, but it says cardiac output is calculated by taking the heart rate and timesing it by the stroke volume. Now, I'm assuming you know what the heart rate is, the number of times the heart beats per minute. Cardiac output is a measure of the total amount of blood that is passed through the heart in a minute. Okay, the heart rate is the number of beats in a minute. The stroke volume is the volume of blood in one beat. So it stands to reason, if you take the volume of blood contained in one beat of the heart, so as the heart fills up and empties out, you take that volume and you times it by the number of beats in a minute, then you can find out the total volume of blood that the heart deals with in a minute, which is called the cardiac output. Okay, so stroke volume is the volume of blood in one beat. Heart rate is the number of beats in a minute, so therefore you times them by each other and you get cardiac output, which is the total volume of blood which passes through a heart in a minute. And that could be a good measure of fitness really, because your cardiac output, your stroke volume is generally a pretty high if you're fit, if your body's trained and your heart's in good condition. But we'll not, bog ourselves down on too many details. So again, just with that couple of minutes, that's just the first bit of it. Cardiac output equals heart rate times stroke volume. You should be able to exchange that equation so that if you're told any two of them, you can work out what the third one is. I'm hoping at a higher level I wouldn't have to go into too much detail about that, but if so, drop me a wee line on email or on Teams to say, can you go through that with me, please? Right, okay, on to the next idea then, which is what's called the cardiac cycle. What we have to understand about the heart is that different things, it's in a different state depending on what's happening. The first thing that has to happen is that blood enters and fills up the two atria. Okay, so the blood enters the atria, the atria then, blood is then pushed down into the ventricles, and then blood is pushed out of the ventricles out to the rest of the body, whether it's to the lungs or to the rest of the body. Now, that is a result of the heart beating in certain ways. Now, we understand that the heartbeat is not a thump, one single thump, 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 thump. For anybody that's measured their heart rate before or felt their heartbeat, you can feel that it actually consists of two smaller bumps, what we call a lub-dub, lub-dub, lub-dub. And what that noise actually is, is the valves closing. That's what makes the noise. But we have to consider a heartbeat as being almost more or less a three-part process. The first part is where the atria contract and push in. That pushes blood down into the ventricles. We call that atrial systole. Atrial meaning the atria, systole. So the first sort of stage, if you like, of the cardiac cycle is atrial systole. So the atria contract, here's contract, here contract, and the blood is pushed down. Now, for atrial systole, these valves, the AV valves, must be open. So AV valves open. And the semilunar valves are closed. So now we have blood in here and in here. So the next thing that happens is ventricular systole. So the ventricles contract. And if we think about what has to happen then, remember that valves are to prevent the backflow of blood. So if we have a contraction from below, the blood in here is getting squeezed. We definitely don't want it to be going back into the atria, so the AV valves are closed. But where we do want it to go is out of the heart, so the semilunar valves are open. Now I know this is quite messy, but you're hearing what I'm saying as well, hopefully. So with atrial systole, the atria will squeeze in, the AV valves open to let blood down into the ventricles. At that point the semilunar valves are closed. Shortly after that, ventricular systole occurs. We'll talk about why and when that happens in a wee minute. But ventricular systole takes place where the ventricles contract. We don't want blood to go back out to here, so the AV valves close and the semilunar valves open. And what happens is our third stage, which is called diastole, which is when actually neither of the atria or the ventricle are contracted. The whole heart just relaxes, and that allows blood to flow in to the atria. And when we have diastole, the semilunar valves will close over. But the AV valves are open. Okay, same idea. The valves are in the same state as atrial systole, which is about to follow, because actually this is a cycle, of course. We go from atrial systole, squeezing in, open and closed. Ventricular systole, squeezing up, closed and open, and then total relaxation. So the blood comes in during diastole. These valves are open. Doesn't matter if they're open or closed really, because the blood's just filling up in here, they're about to be pushed down there, so it makes sense these valves stay open at that point. But we don't want any blood leaving the heart at that point or to be sucked back in this way, so those valves close. So you can memorise that, but it's as I've told you before, at higher level you're better off to understand why something is the case rather than to memorise it. Okay, so again, rewind and go through this bit. Atrial systole and the valves, what they're doing, ventricular systole and the valves, what they are doing, and diastole, what the valves do during diastole. Okay, I'm going to give the board just a tiny little clean to talk about the next bit, because by now I'm hoping you've paused and watched a couple of times and you're happy that you understand what atrial systole, ventricular systole and diastole are. What we're going to understand by the end of the next couple of minutes is how that process actually takes place. How does the heart know to go from one state to another? And the shortest possible answer to that question is this structure here found in the right atrium. It's called the Sino atrial node, and it is connected to the brain. Again, we'll come to that at the next stage. It's connected to the brain, so it's receiving electrical signals, electrical impulses via neurons from the brain. When it receives a signal, it spreads an electric impulse across the top of the heart, causing atrial systole. But not only that, it then sends a signal to a second structure called a node, an AVN, the atrioventricular node, called such because it's in between the atrium and the ventricles. And when it receives its signal, it then passes electrical impulses across the bottom of the heart to cause ventricular systole. So we get a signal from the brain to the SAN, which triggers atrial systole, but as well as triggering atrial systole, also sends a signal to the AVN, the atrioventricular node, to cause ventricular systole. And then when there is no impulse at all, we go into this diastolic stage, so it's totally relaxed and it's filling back up with blood again. Okay, so that's the electrical impulses, and that can be shown on what's called an electrocardiogram. You can measure the electrical impulse. So an electrocardiogram is generally a little bump, a big bump, and then it flattens out. It goes right down below and flattens out. That's your typical. That's a typical shape of an electrocardiogram. Generally speaking, you see it in TV programs, or if you've ever visited Indian hospitals, been linked up to one, it can count the heartbeat, because obviously if you count the number of peaks in a minute, or over a certain period of time, you can work out how many peaks there were in a minute and therefore work out heart rate from it. That's something you might be expected to do. But it's also worthwhile understanding what each little part of it is. So the first initial little bump, that's the electrical signal going across the heart to cause atrial systole. The bigger bump, as you might imagine, it's a much bigger push, because you're not just trying to push blood down here. This push is actually trying to push blood all the way around the body. So that that requires a bigger electrical signal, ventricular systole, and then when we get to diastole, it kind of just levels out. Okay, so that's what we call an electrocardiogram or an ECG. So atrial systole is your initial little bump, ventricular systole is a bigger bump, and then when it levels out, that's your diastole. So that's the electrical sort of way of measuring the electricity that's passing across the heart during those three stages: atrial systole, ventricular systole and diastole. Okay, and the only thing left really to talk about, there's two things really further to talk about, and I'll take these away just so that you can watch that bit of the video where I talked about that and talked about this as well. But what we're about to move on to talk about is the brain's control of the heart. Now, as I told you before, the SAN is connected to the brain. It's connected via nerves, but it's also connected hormonally as well. The medulla, we learned at National 5, controls automatic reactions such as the heart rate and the breathing. We call it the autonomic nervous system, or the ANS. It's part of things that happen automatically in your body. We have two different, we'll learn a wee bit more about this, by the way, when we get into neurobiology. We haven't done that bit yet, so don't worry too much about it, but it is worth giving you a bit of background. We have two systems. The autonomic system is made up of two halves, and each of those halves sort of is what we call antagonistic from each other, which means they have equal and opposite reactions. So we have what's called the sympathetic side of the ANS, and we also have a parasympathetic system. So the sympathetic system prepares us for winding the body up, fight or flight, okay? Parasympathetic, on the other hand, is about relaxing your body back down again. So the sympathetic system speeds the heart up, and parasympathetic system slows the heart down. I always think to myself that is counterintuitive for me for the word sympathetic. If you say sympathetic to me, that's sort of you make a sympathetic sound like, oh, that's almost like a slowing down, but it's actually counterintuitive. The sympathetic system speeds the heart rate up. There's other things as well which we'll talk about, but at the moment we're only talking about the heart. So the sympathetic system is related to a hormone called noradrenaline, which causes heart rate to increase. The parasympathetic system, which causes your heart to slow down again. So if you're recovering from exercise or something, the system that's slowing your heart back down again is helped by the hormone acetylcholine. So we have noradrenaline and acetylcholine are your two equal and opposite effects. The sympathetic system to speed up the heart rate, the parasympathetic system to slow the heart rate down. The only remaining thing as part of this topic, because we're already at 18 minutes, so I'm fully expecting you're pausing each of these sections, you're stopping, you're getting a chance to have a look, think about it and then move on. The final thing we're going to talk about is blood pressure. If I start by putting down a sort of fairly standard blood pressure, which is 120 over 80. 120 over 80 is a fairly standard healthy blood pressure. 120 is a measure of blood pressure in an artery during systole. The lower number is the pressure of the blood during diastole. Okay? So this is when the heart beats, and that's when the heart's relaxed. And that's why you have two different numbers. That's why blood pressure is made up of two different numbers. That's your diastolic, so your systolic pressure, and that's your diastolic pressure. Now, to summarise then, we looked at heart structure there, we looked at the cardiac cycle, we looked at the nodes that control that cardiac cycle, we looked at an electrocardiogram, we also looked at the autonomic nervous system and the idea that we have a sympathetic and parasympathetic side to the nervous system, and we also to the control of the heart. We also looked at blood pressure, and I nearly forgot we talked about cardiac output as well. So a lot in that, but at 19.5 minutes, guys, I do not expect you would watch this entire video once and think, well, I know it now. Watch this in parts. As always, there's no point in me telling this at the end. Hope that makes sense, guys.